Picture this. You're scrolling through your phone on a random Tuesday night, and you see a $100 bill sitting in your wallet that you weren't planning to spend. Maybe it was a birthday gift. Maybe it's just money you forgot you had. And a thought crosses your mind: what if I actually invested this instead of letting it sit there? For most people, that thought disappears in about 8 seconds. It gets replaced with, I don't have enough to make it worth it, or, I'll start investing when I have real money. So the $100 ends up on food delivery, a pair of shoes, or it just quietly evaporates into things you won't remember buying a month from now. But here's the question nobody really answers honestly: what actually happens, mentally and financially, the moment you take that same $100 and put it into an investment instead? Not 50 years from now. Not when you retire. What happens this week, this month, in your brain and in your bank account? Because the truth is, that first $100 does something far more important than making you rich. It rewires the way you see money for the rest of your life. And almost nobody tells you that part. The problem with how we think about investing. Here's the belief that quietly keeps millions of people from ever starting: the idea that investing only matters if you're investing a lot. We've been trained to think of investing as something for people with spare thousands lying around. Something you do later. Something that requires a financial advisor, a suit, and a 6-figure salary. So people wait. They tell themselves a story that goes something like this: I'll start investing once I pay off my debt. Or, I'll start once I get a raise. Or the most dangerous one of all, $100 won't even make a difference, so what's the point? That last belief feels logical. It even feels responsible. But it's actually one of the most expensive thoughts a person can have, because it's not really about the $100 at all. It's about what that $100 represents. Think about it like this. Imagine 2 people. One person spends every extra dollar the moment they get it, because it's not enough to matter anyway. The other person takes even small, seemingly insignificant amounts and puts them to work. 10 years later, these 2 people don't just have different bank balances. They have completely different relationships with money. One sees money as something that disappears. The other sees money as something that grows. And that difference in mindset ends up mattering more than the actual $100 ever did. What actually happens when you invest $100? So let's break down, step by step, what really happens when you take that $100 and invest it, say, into a simple, low-cost index fund, which is essentially a basket that holds tiny pieces of hundreds of companies at once instead of betting on just one. The moment that $100 goes in, on paper, nothing dramatic happens. You don't suddenly get rich. If the market goes up 2% that month, you've made $2. If it drops 2%, you've lost $2, at least on paper. To someone looking only at the numbers, this seems almost pointless. $2? Why bother? But here's what's actually happening behind the scenes, and it's the part almost nobody explains. That $100 is no longer just money. It's now a small working asset. It's out in the world, owning tiny slices of real businesses, earning alongside the economy, instead of sitting in your account losing value to inflation every single day it does nothing. Let's use a simple comparison. Imagine money as water. Cash sitting in a checking account is like water sitting in a bucket in the sun. Slowly, quietly, it evaporates. Not because you're spending it, but because prices around you are rising every year, which means the same $100 buys a little less next year than it does today. That's inflation, and it's constantly working, whether you notice it or not. Now imagine that same water poured into a small stream instead of a bucket. It's still just water. It didn't multiply overnight. But it's moving. It's connected to something bigger. And a stream, over time, carves paths that a bucket never could. That's the real shift that happens when you invest your first $100. You've moved your money from a bucket into a stream. The psychological shift nobody talks about. Here's where it gets interesting, because the biggest change isn't in your bank account. It's in your brain. Before you invest, money feels like a single event. You get paid, you spend it, it's gone, repeat. It's a loop. But the moment you invest even a small amount, something shifts. You start checking in on it. You start noticing when the market moves. You start asking questions you never asked before, like, wait, why did this go up, or, what actually is a stock? This is called the ownership effect in psychology. Humans pay far more attention to things they own than things they don't. Renting an apartment and owning an apartment create completely different levels of care, even if it's the exact same building. The same thing happens with money. When you're just spending cash, you're a passenger. When you invest, even $10 or $20, you become a participant. You start paying attention to a system you used to completely ignore. And this is the real, hidden value of that first $100. It's not the $2 of growth. It's the fact that you now have skin in the game, which means your brain starts building financial awareness automatically, without you forcing it. There's also something else happening, something almost invisible. You start proving a belief to yourself. Before investing, most people carry a quiet assumption that says, I'm not really a person who invests. That's for other people, people who are already wealthy. But the second you actually do it, even with a small amount, that identity starts to shift. You become someone who invests. Not because you said so, but because you did it. And identity, more than motivation, more than discipline, is what determines whether someone builds wealth over the next 20 years or stays stuck in the same financial patterns their entire life. Why small amounts matter more than people think. Let's talk about the actual math for a second, because it explains why starting small isn't a weakness. It's the entire strategy. If you invest $100 and it grows at a steady average pace over time, say roughly 7% a year, which is close to the long-term historical average for a broad market index, that $100 can roughly double every 10 years. So in 30 years, without you adding a single extra cent, that same $100 could turn into around $800. Now, on its own, $800 in 30 years doesn't sound like a life-changing number. And if that were the whole story, this video wouldn't be worth making. But here's the actual insight: almost nobody stops at $100. The person who invests their first $100 almost never leaves it at just that one deposit. Once the identity shift happens, once investing stops feeling like something abstract and starts feeling like something they actually do, they add more. $50 next month. $100 the month after. It becomes a habit instead of a one-time event. This is the same psychological pattern behind almost every consistent habit humans build. Nobody goes to the gym once and becomes fit. But the first time you go, something shifts. You stop being someone who should work out and start being someone who works out. The first $100 invested works exactly the same way for your financial identity. The deeper insight: money follows identity, not the other way around. Here's the idea most personal finance content misses completely. We're taught that wealth building is a math problem. Save this percentage, invest in this fund, wait this many years. And technically, that's true. But underneath the math is a psychological reality that actually drives whether people follow through at all. People don't build wealth because they suddenly understand compound interest. They build wealth because, at some point, their identity shifted from someone who spends whatever they have to someone who puts their money to work. And identity shifts don't usually happen from reading a definition. They happen from taking one small action that proves it's true. That's why the first $100 matters so much more than its dollar value suggests. It's not really an investment in the stock market. It's an investment in a new version of how you see yourself financially. And once that identity takes hold, the amounts naturally start growing, not because you forced discipline, but because it now feels aligned with who you are. This is also why people who inherit large sums of money, without ever building that identity first, so often lose it. The money arrived, but the mindset never did. Meanwhile, people who start small, who take that uncomfortable first step with an amount that feels almost too small to matter, tend to build something that actually lasts, because the foundation isn't just money. It's a mindset that was earned one small decision at a time. What you should actually do with this. So what does this mean practically? It doesn't mean you need to become an expert overnight, or pick the perfect stock, or time some ideal moment to begin. In fact, waiting for the right time is usually just another version of the same fear that keeps people stuck forever. What it means is this: the amount matters far less than the decision. If you have $100 sitting somewhere doing nothing, moving it into something simple, like a broad index fund, isn't about getting rich from that single deposit. It's about becoming the kind of person who has money working for them instead of money that just disappears. Start small, start uncomfortable, start with an amount that feels almost silly. Because the goal was never really about that first $100. It was about becoming someone who doesn't need convincing the next time. Ending. So the next time you have $100 that you weren't planning to spend, ask yourself a different question. Not, is this enough to matter, but, who do I become the moment I actually do this? Because the real return on your first $100 was never just the money. It was the version of you that showed up the moment you decided to stop waiting.